Welcome to the 5th episode of Language and Society. My name is Nida Salashur, and today I have Dr Majid Khosravinik on the show with us. We'll be talking a bit about what social media discourse analysis is, as well as unpacking one of Majid's recent projects to understand the features of Arabism and Persian nationalism. So do stay tuned. Right, so welcome to another episode of Language and Society. In this episode, I have invited Dr Majid Khosravinik onto the show. Now, Majid is a senior lecturer in digital media and discourse studies at Newcastle University. We initially met roughly 5 years ago at the CADAD, or what is otherwise known as the Critical Approaches to Discourse Analysis Across Disciplines conference, which was held in Budapest at the time. And I've actually been following Majid's work for years now and have drawn on his scholarly work in my own research as we share very similar research interests. And so with that, it gives me great pleasure to have him on this episode of the podcast. Welcome, Majid, and thank you very much for joining us today. I think what would be really useful is if you could tell us a bit about your academic expertise and how what you study and research is relevant to our everyday lives.
Thank you very much, Neda, for your invitation. My research is focused on discourse and representation. Basically, we work based on the assumption that communication and communication content matters, and it's linked to power relations in society, and in a sense that the way people or powerful people talk about a phenomenon kind of constructs the way that issue or topic is perceived in wider society. So and then we'll try to see how this links to ideologies, for example, or perspectives which dominate our social structures or political structures. So in a sense, we argue that discourse, as in language and videos and any form of meaning making that we use, matters and is powerful. So when it is powerful, it's automatically also political because it relates to the way that, for example, our collective identities are represented or perceived or talked about in the society. Then we have the point of who is talking to whom under what conditions. So not everybody has the same discursive power, if you like. So if you are a politician, for example, you have a lot of discursive power because you can influence a lot of people, but also you have influence in the institution of politics. So that matters in policy making and all of that. But also, there's a term that I really like a lot, and Van Dyck uses that, and that is symbolic elite. So that means the group of people who have wider access to large groups of people, and they can actually talk with a larger group, and hence having an impact on them. This means people like politicians, people like media elites, people who are on media as one institution, but also people like journalists or even lecturers, teachers, and public figures in general. And they have preferential and more controlled access to symbolic resources, which means basically meaning making.
Thanks for that, Majid. So if I were to summarize, discourse analysts like yourself and we're interested in language and discourse because the language and discourse that we get exposed to on a daily basis impacts our perceptions and our beliefs. And so the old children's saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, really is not true, because what proponents like Majid and I see in research is that some people, often referred to as the elites or media elites, actually hold tremendous power over discourse. And therefore, it's important for us to understand the discourse we get exposed to through media platforms, and to understand who actually has a say in the information that the general public does and does not get given. And so that takes me on to my next question, because the landscape of media has changed tremendously over the last couple of decades as a result of the arrival of social media. And, you know, traditionally media critics have often criticized media companies such as newspaper companies or broadcasting companies for playing a gatekeeping role wherein they decide what the general public gets exposed to. They decide what the public hears and sees and reads. And people don't really have a say in what goes into a news article, for example. And so I'd like to hear a bit about your interest in social media discourse, and whether you think that social media platforms have actually afforded us a more two-way, a more mutual opportunity to input into public discourse than was formerly available under traditional media platforms such as newspapers and broadcasting companies.
Social media and mass media are radically different from communicative point of view. And by that, I mean, if you think about mass media, for example, television, there is a linearity of the way text and content are produced and consumed. If you think, for example, a news program to be a product, then we have very specific group of people, i.e. media elites, producing it, and a very specific group of people, media industry owners, to distribute it, and very specific group of people, which is actually the society at large, to consume it. So we have a linear progression for textual practice from the producers to consumers. And there's a very clear cut between producers and consumers. These are not really mixed. They're two different groups of people. And then obviously the discursive power lies with the media elites, because they have control over how to put together a news article, for example. So but when you take that to social media, again, from a communicative point of view, this linearity and one-to-many communication dynamic does not exist. And that means that anybody can be producer, anybody can be consumer, and anybody can be distributor of the text. Theoretically speaking and technically speaking, this is the essence of what I call social media communication paradigm, in which, theoretically at least speaking, I will get to that later. This is a new dynamic which is radically different from the assumption that we had about mass media paradigm of communication. And that's why we refer to these group of, I mean, in some literature, I mean, there are different terms to be used for them. They refer to these group of people as prosumers.
And I would assume that the word prosumers is a blended word, is that right?
Yeah, it's actually basically putting producer and consumer together.
Now, I can agree that social media certainly has afforded the general public an opportunity to influence public discourse. But would you agree that, in reality, social media, as it has currently been set up and designed, still shares some of the same features of mass media that critics have commonly criticized?
Yes, then yeah, I mean, from the media design perspective, this is the idea, for this to be circular and fluid in terms of anybody can become a celebrity, for example, or having so many followers to influence. But in practice, it is definitely what you refer to. It is not completely structurally fluid and circular. It is basically a different dynamic, but gradually is actually bringing back the old dynamic into the new media design, which begs the question of whether or not this has really helped the situation in participation and democratic inclusion and all those aspects, which is basically, my answer to that would be yes and no. It depends on what context and what specific communicative community we are talking about. So in some of my research, I'm actually working with the assumption that yes, it is doing that. For example, when in a context where there is more controlled situation for a public sphere, as in like not everybody has access to be represented in the media, in less democratic societies, basically, like in Arab Spring, for example, that happened, and basically the counter public. The public, they did actually exploited some of these new affordances of speaking their voice and making a change and creating this discursive currents for their cause, really. So it depends on that specific context. But in general, if you think about the what is referred to as global north or what I sometimes refer to as late modern societies. It's not my coinage, it's actually Fairclough's actually. The situation is this increasingly disappointing, to be honest. And that is mainly because, from my perspective, the same problems or the same issues which were causing mass media not to perform their democratic duty is also impacting social media industry as well, and that is in a very simple form market logic and capitalism, basically. It is much more complicated though in social media, but it is more or less the dominance of market logic, which valorizes or monetizes the content, the communicative content as the currency, and deals with that as a commodity. That has vast consequences in terms of democratic participation and discursive practice.
Now, given that you're collecting data from online platforms, such as social media platforms, versus what traditionally would be from, say, text from newspaper articles, I assume that there would be new layers of consideration that a researcher like yourself would need to take into account. And in a lot of your recent work, you refer to using digital ethnography to observe and to gather that data. Can you explain a little bit more about this process and what some of those considerations might be?
Yeah, this is a bit of an interdisciplinary debate that is going on in the field of, I would say, the field of critical discourse studies, because traditionally the scholars in the field were dealing with data as more or less separated body of material that they I mean, I always use this metaphor, that they can take home and do research on, which is not exactly within the principles of CDA, because we always talk about the fact that in the critical discourse analysis, we are supposed to look at process of production, distribution, and consumption. And in doing that, a lot of previous research also have considered digital ethnography in general as part of their methods. So my take is that with the digital media and this multimedia nature and multimodal nature of the data, which is the language being used, the videos, sound, posters, memes, all that, which we already know about, plus new ways of meaning making, which includes, for example, stuff like smileys, or even the way that we communicate through systems, regimes of likes or shares or tags or hashtags. So these are also meaning making. It's part of the discursive material that I think should be analyzed. Hence, I'm actually referring to this whole body of data as meaning making content and practices. So in that sense, when I was thinking about it like that, I really thought that this is really impossible to extract the data from this context, the digital context, and then go and analyze it. which it's not impossible. It's just that I think it loses some of its value in that sense. So I have been actually thinking and trying to write about how we should approach it from an observational point of view and do the analysis through ethnography.
Thanks for that, Majid. And so, as most of us researchers are aware, whenever you're working with data from people or from animals, there are ethical considerations that one needs to bear in mind. Is there a consensus between researchers as to how online data shared, say, on social media platforms should be treated? And what are some ethical implications that one needs to bear in mind when working with such data?
Yeah, I mean, the ethical dimension is huge in doing research online, and to be honest, it's very complicated and it is emerging. It changes. There are books written on that because there are all different levels of risks and ethical consideration that you have to consider. It could be about, for example, doxing. If you're giving out information about someone which leads for them to be identified, or outing someone just like that, or also risk to the researchers, in terms of what kind of material that they deal with. For example, I have had a postdoc working with me on the discourses of terrorism online, and there is a huge ethical consideration in terms of the health and safety of the researcher. But also I've seen this for people who are working on misogynist discourse or other discourses, because it is quite traumatic to deal with what goes on online, because it's brutal, obviously. But yes, there is a huge consideration in terms of what you can or cannot do online. So there is a general common perception that if it is publicly available online, then it should be fine to write about and all of that, which is quite simplistic if you ask me, because anonymization also is not a simple procedure. It's not just taking out the name and then you can use the data, because the data may actually lead to a lot of information about that user. So this is more complicated than what it looks. But on the other hand, also, we don't want this to prevent us from doing research online. And that's actually, to be honest, that's one of the problems now we have about the problematic discourses online. If you take misogynist discourses, homophobic discourse, racist discourses, all of these, everybody kind of knows that there's a huge problem about these discourses online. But when it comes to putting your finger on it and say how it is and where it is, then the research about them is going to be very complicated, and to some extent it's going to be ad hoc and sporadic, because you cannot do much with the data. So that's why also, again, with the digital ethnography, I think you can reveal a lot more about that context rather than going to the detail of the text, for example. I would like actually to refer to Association of Internet Researchers who actually produce annual reports on ethics of internet research, which is a key factor in or key document to go to for trying to see what is the best practice at the moment, really. Another aspect of the ethical issue is about the way you report problematic data, for example. How many of these examples are you going to put in your publication? So what you don't want to do is to inadvertently just to propagate the same kind of racist propaganda or stereotypes again in print, to give people ideas about what may be something to say if you're a racist. So I mean, one of our research, for example, on Arabism and Persian and nationalist discourses, we actually had to leave out a lot of examples in our categorization of thematic analysis of what we found, because we thought that this is really not necessary, and reproducing it is really problematic. The same for fascism discourse. I know people actually have this issue, and there's huge consideration there in terms of what you should publicize. It's publication. I know it's academic publication and probably not going too far, but it still is publication.
That's very true. We researchers also need to be very careful as to the language we use when we are describing the data that we're working with, so as not to reproduce the same racist, misogynist, ageist discourse that we're actually critiquing. Now, you mentioned in passing one of your recent projects, and I'd actually like to take this opportunity to delve a little deeper into two specific projects that you've worked on recently, both of them relating to nationalism, specifically Arab nationalism and Persian nationalism. You have two articles called Persian Nationalism, Identity and Anti-Arab Sentiments in Iranian Facebook Discourses, and a second article called Social Media Discourses of Arabism and the Negotiation of Self in the Middle East. Now, both of these projects are contextualized in the Persian versus Arabian Gulf debate. But for those who may not be familiar with this debate, can you please give us some social, political, and geographical context to this debate?
As you may know, actually, this is the very long-standing, I would say, territorial debate. This is about this body of water in the south of Iran, which is basically a natural border between Iran, which basically formerly referred to as Persia, and the list of countries around that Gulf, who are all Arabs. So it's actually between the Arab identity and what is consumed or what is perceived as Persian identity. So it's always been there. There's a lot of history of rivalry in the region. It goes back to early years of Islam when Muslims actually conquered Iran, which is already a big established and very developed bureaucratic system. And then they actually advanced their conquest to the east, to Pakistan and India and all of that. It's very interesting to know that. I always find this interesting that it's, the importance of Iran in the Muslim conquest from the west, i.e. where Saudi Arabia is now, towards east, is just so much that for countries after Iran, as in in Afghanistan or Pakistan and India and wherever else that Islam goes to the east, the language of the religion of Islam is some form of Persian. It's some dialect or it has a very close affinity with Persian language, whereas the conquest to the east and North Africa and all of that, they were all Arabs. So basically, Iranian language was so strong at the time that actually it became the language of Muslim conquest to the east of Iran. So there was this rivalry, and there has been this discourse throughout history. And then there is a lot of geopolitical issues going on. The situation is actually very complicated with the ruling governments also playing some part in this. So this is mostly a socially infused discourse right now in Iran, and that is about an alternative identity that some people in Iran think is the original and real identity of Iranians, which is Persian identity, with all the problematic connotations that it may have, i.e., for example, not every Iranian is Persian in terms of ethnicity and language. So, but also I was always very much interested to also include something which is on the other side. I know that this self-other is not really a one-side game really, and that's why I teamed up with a couple of colleagues in the other side, i.e. from Kuwait University, to analyze the Arabist discourse, like how this Arabist discourse stands or defines itself against the perceived Persian discourse.
So given that context, what were your findings? What were the key characteristics of Persian and Arab nationalism? And I say key because I know there's probably a lot of nuances involved and a lot of time is actually needed to unpack these nuances. But very briefly, what were those key features?
Persian national identity discourse has the claim to be secular and basically non-Islamic. They assume that the Persians, which they mean Iranian through that, they were not Muslim, and the Muslim identity was forced upon them through the war, and this should be removed basically. So we have to go back to this Persian historic identity, which is not Muslim. It is at the same time pretty much exclusionary in terms of what it assumes about what Iranians are, i.e. it assumes that everybody is Persian or is a contingent group to Persians, which is the central identity. It's pretty much anti-Islam, anti-Arab, and in that sense also it has some sort of standoff with the official identity, national identity of Iran, which is the Muslim Shia identity. So in that sense, they associate these two together, like Arabs with the ruling government. Sometimes so they use basically Arabs as a swear word, really. On the Arabist side, they pretty much are focused on the language of Arabic and the religion of Islam. So Islam is the core identity marker for the Arabist discourse, and then they construct the other, which is the Iranian or Persian discourse, as the non-Muslim. So in a sense, when they argue that Persians are not Muslim, they are constructing a negative other for them, but at the same time, the Persian discourse affiliates actually they also say the same thing basically, but they associate a positive attribute to being Muslim. So it's very interesting the fact that the context of interpretations are so different, and that's why the same message comes to be interpreted differently at both sides of this debate, really. And as I mentioned, the Arabist discourse is also exclusionary. It actually forces a very monolithic unity across anybody who speaks Arabic, and it kind of assumes that there are same levels of religiosity and same level of standoff, basically. So in that sense, that's also very exclusionary in that sense.
Now, I'm going to finally end with a bit of a difficult question for you there, Majid. A lot of people say that critical discourse analysis is actually discourse analysis with an attitude. And the reason they say that is because critical discourse analysts actually make their positions very clear. So if we're actually working with on a very controversial topic, we might ultimately have a very specific position, and we make that position very clear within our research. So given your extensive work on this topic, in your opinion, is it Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf?
Okay, so this is the question that I get, well, not a lot, but sometimes, the research that we did, use this debate as a way of accessing the relevant discursive data. So it was not like we didn't go into this to take sides, obviously, but we thought that this debate is really a good place to see what this nationalist discourse is, and what it refers to and how it constructs itself, which turned out to be pretty rich data and all of that. So we don't officially have a take on that, but we do actually talk about the context in the sense of how this has developed and why it's a problem. Historically speaking, it's always been Persian Gulf, and with no debates around it for many centuries, and There's ample evidence for that, really. But also, that history doesn't necessarily mean that it has to stay that way. I'm not saying that it should change or not change. I'm just I don't really have a solution as per naming of it, for a couple of reasons. One, I don't think naming it this way or that way is going to solve any problem, because this is about a discursive struggle. This debate is about the name, but changing the name doesn't mean that that debate and that rivalry is going to go away, because it has, as we discussed, it has other reasons percolating behind it. So the same reasons still exist. But the other thing is that from whose perspective are we talking about? Are we talking about people who are in the center of Iran, like Tehran, for example, and thinking about that body of water in the south of Iran to be called this way or that way because we identify as Persians or not? Because, as you know, we also have quite a big minority of Arabs living inside Iran and at the border of this body of water as well. I know I have been working in those areas for some time, and I think they also refer to it as the Gulf, without any Arabic or Persian name attached to that. So in a sense, if you think about those people, maybe you should not really push your own perception, which is centrist perception of the name. But on the other hand, I don't really see a point in changing the name, even though it's very controversial at the moment. As I said, this is really not about the name. This is about the complex network of discourses which have created this issue, and it is a scapegoat. It's not really about the name. It's about the standoff. It's about identity crisis. So in that sense, maybe we have more complicated and more pressing issues to resolve there, really.
Dr. Majid Khosravinik, thank you very much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I hope you could make sense of some of these stuff that we talked about, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Language and Society. If you did, then one way to show your support is by sharing it through your network of friends and colleagues, as well as on your social media platforms. My name is Nida Salashur. Until next time, take care.